Alright, so like most of the reviews I've done for movies that have come out this year, I wanted to do this one a little differently also. And that is to do, back a while ago when we first started, we kind of somewhat started this thing that didn't really go anywhere, where we, for the bigger movies, or the movies that called for it, we would do one regular review video and then one shorter video that was just about like the spoilers. But this is similar to that, but the reason I'm doing it this way mainly is basically I'm still responding to Get Out 2 years later. Because if you've been watching these, you know that Get Out was one of my favorite movies from a couple of years ago in that year. So, and the thing about it was when you watch that movie, and despite what Daniel Kaluuya kind of tried to make it, though I do understand where he's coming from, where it was the whole basically I've seen Get Out 3 or 4 times became the new like, I have a black friend, or I would have voted for Obama for a third time, as Bradley Whitford said. Um, but I do think that's kind of a bad example for that movie to use that and say that, because Get Out is a movie that is like so layered and has to be seen so many times to get everything, that I would say mildly put off by that, but once again, I'm sure those people are out there also that say that for that particular reason. But yeah, for the most part, that's what I really loved about Get Out, and the fact that however many times I saw it, it just got better, and like so many different things started to come to light that I hadn't noticed before. And I figure this is pretty much exactly the same way, to the point that I basically fear, like I was just going to do this in one video, but the thing is that I knew because of that, that I would go into this basically distracted, because I'd just be looking for the small things that may or may not come back, or may not mean something more or something. So I figured it'd just be easier to digest as a whole if I saw it tonight and just watched it as it was and reacted in that sense, and then I'll see it again tomorrow morning, and then we'll go into all that stuff, and also go into all the spoilers and stuff like that also. So this is basically just like kind of an initial thing. I was really lucky to get in with the crowds that were out for this, but yeah, so luckily I was able to do this at all. So going into it, obviously Peele was a bit upset about the whole people weren't quite sure what genre they were sticking Get Out in. When he clearly wanted to make it, the thriller with the, commentary on the race and the whole, the way people that are supposedly, pro everything still kind of have those racist tendencies, like we see in Bradley Whitford's character and stuff like that. And this, he wanted there to be, like, no question, and no, like, well, it's a little bit of this, but it's also a little bit of this. He wanted it to basically be straightforward horror, despite the fact that it still has, underlying things. Not about race this time, but we'll get into all that tomorrow, or by the time this is put up, probably one right after the other, if you care that much. So, and about him going into basically full horror, it does kind of start right away in that sense. Not necessarily that it starts with like a huge scare or anything, but this whole opening scene set in 1986 on this boardwalk at night, with the girl who will eventually be Lupita, with her mom and dad, basically just going around, playing the games and doing all that other stuff. But the interesting setup here is that even though it's like, I mean, yeah, it's night, but like there's lights everywhere and there's people everywhere, it's still, in any other way, an incredibly non-threatening place. But there's still something that just seems to be looming over this scene. I guess if it's the way it's shot and the way how a lot of it feels like. I know he supposedly got a lot of inspiration from Spielberg, among many, many people, but he did single out Spielberg at one point, and that was something I wasn't quite grasping, despite the fact that obviously, I suppose there's a couple of scares on a beach, and the kid's wearing a Jaws shirt at one point. But the one thing I kind of looked for was the whole thing of, like, when you look at movies like E.T., where a lot of it's from, like, a child's perspective, so the camera is, like, often lower than it usually would be. And I kind of got that sense with this opening scene, seeing all this kind of from her point of view, and how everything sort of just seems like this sort of, I don't know, like there's this intimidating darkness of something that we're not quite seeing before it's building to a scene that we don't quite see the payoff of yet. Um, so just right away, without even doing anything particularly big, I love just how much it set up this real dark feel to it that was just really unsettling from the get-go. Which then takes us into the opening title sequence, which is interesting because you know how a lot of movies, or a lot of directors tend to have that certain style, and despite the fact that he's doing a totally different story here, the question was going to be, like, how much like Get Out is it going to be, like, stylistically, I guess. Um, and there is something here that kind of reminds me of, like, the Woody Allen style, where, like, every single one of Woody Allen's movies has the exact same title sequence with the same font and the same style and all that. Um, and yeah, this does have, like the font of the credits is the same font as Get Out's, and it's red instead of blue, and it's the whole thing where it's on, like, one particular image, and there's, like, the eerie soundtrack over it. Very similar, but the interesting thing here is that in Get Out, the first half of the credits are that, and then it transitions to Redbone on the soundtrack, and then goes from there. So there's, like, that kind of, sort of juxtaposition with it. And the thing is once you kind of catch on that the credits are similar to Get Out in that fashion, you're kind of waiting for the transition to something. Obviously, it wouldn't be Redbone in this case. And, like, I Got Five on, it's going to be, a theme here at some point, we know from all the advertising. But that's not what that's used for, and that doesn't come. The whole sequence is just the eerie soundtrack with no cutting to anything else like Get Out did. So that kind of anticipation for something that didn't quite come, I also thought was kind of sort of putting you on the edge in this really interesting way before it even really started. So I did really like that stuff. So going into it now, the thing that they're really building up, first off, the pacing here is incredible because I kind of looked at it, I kind of somewhat glanced when I watched this because I was curious sometimes about how much is, even if I'm totally not bored by something, sometimes I'll look just to see, how well it's going. And it's like, what, maybe 45 minutes in or longer before the shit really starts to go down, like what you're kind of expecting it to be. But it doesn't feel like that at all. This opening is, like, so intoxicating without even doing, like, it feels like it's not a whole lot, but that's the skillful thing that he does, is he is putting all that sort of fear and dread in it without you hardly even realizing it. Before it does get to, like, the big scares that we're coming to expect, when everything starts to come into play that we know the movie is about. But in the meantime, it's just really going on this whole thing of Lupita just kind of has this fear inside her and this dread, like she's anticipating something. She just doesn't know what. And this fear that she's trying to explain to him, especially with all the coincidences she keeps saying that she's trying to explain. In some cases, it's laying it on kind of a bit thick. Like the frisbee landing on the circle and stuff like that. By the time the frisbee thing happens, it's kind of like, yeah, we kind of get the point. It almost comes off a little silly. But, I mean, prior to that, they do it in a way like the twins talking at the same time right before that. And the thing is, yeah, you've seen that kind of thing before, and they even do the Jinx thing, but at the same time, it's like they're almost a little too synced the way they did it, and it's really weird in this really good way. And so that, it's just little things like that are just, we don't even realize it if you're just, letting it flow by itself without thinking about it, that there's just planting those seeds of uneasiness throughout, just like right under your nose, and that's adds so much than you could really possibly even describe, which I really love. But then it does start to get a bit more, I don't know, blatant sounds negative, but that's just the word that comes to mind. It's more sort of in the foreground, the terror and all that. Um, so we get scenes like when they first see, the family in the driveway, and Winston Duke goes over and he opens the door and he's talking to Lupita about how he's going to handle the situation. But the way the framing is, where he's on one side and the already ajar door is kind of like in the entire other half of the frame. You're just kind of anticipating that something's going to come through and attack him. And the fact that that's not what happens is really... But just that they were able to set up that tension just in those little ways where even... I'm not even totally sure that's intentional. But if it is, it's effective, and if not, then luck is just totally on his side. So, and I was talking about Lupita talking about fear and all that, and the coincidences, and that's another thing too. Especially when you look at like what Dana Kaluuya and Allison Williams were doing in Get Out. Where a lot of the fear and the dread in the movie can also come from the performances themselves, where like that just really wouldn't quite be there unless the performances really, really sold it, and that's especially in Lupita's case, and that's even before we see the other her. Just her describing how she's feeling is already sort of scary in itself. But then they have to come in, and everybody in this movie obviously has like a dual role. The main cast. So what's here is a lot of the time when they're playing these characters, obviously with it's something you just kind of don't think about because it's so well made and put together, and this is obviously movie magic that's gone back since forever, that they've been able to do the whole it looks like one actor as two. But in this particular case, it is like so easy to not even think about that, and from that kind of angle, because the performances are so incredibly different, especially with the idea that the other family is like a lot more animalistic. Like you've got the evil version of the son just kind of like runs around on his hands and knees, and that's just startling by itself. And Winston Duke basically speaking in like barks, not too dissimilar from his Black Panther calls or whatever, but it's much more sort of frightening in this case for sure. Whereas it was a sign of relief in Black Panther, not so much here. And talking about that, that's also reminded me of the beginning. There's the setup to the horror of what's going to happen is the girl going into like a hall of mirrors, and it's like there's also, if the Key and Peele fans out there will remember the whole where they did the spoof of an action movie and they do this whole comedic scene in a hall of mirrors, and it's like, to associate Peele with one Hall of Mirrors in this really comedic sense, and now to associate him with it in this, horror sense, is really, actually, somewhat risky to do that. But, or maybe I just love that sketch so much, maybe I just think more about it than most people probably should. But I did notice the connection there, and I do like that he was able to kind of do both. So... but then there's also characters like Elisabeth Moss. There is one particular scene where all Elisabeth Moss has to do in this scene is put on lip gloss. And that's kind of all I really want to say. There's more I want to talk about with Elisabeth Moss, which, like I said, we'll probably do tomorrow. But the thing is the fact that all these... I was starting to say this and then I trailed off. The fact that every actor kind of has to play off of themselves, which I found really interesting, because, like, when the daughter is being, pursued by her evil version, there's a lot of that between the main actors here, and it's like, and especially Lupita playing off herself, and it's like, I am really curious exactly how this was put together in regards to which performance was shot first, because then that would be the one that their other performance has to play off of. So that's just this whole can of worms of interesting to think about, and then the whole like just in the whole conception of how this was, and the fact that basically these acting exercises that can be put into this full on horror movie, since horror movies haven't always had the reputation of having great performances in them, but the fact that we're now kind of in an age with stuff like, this and Hereditary and A Quiet Place, stuff like that, where we can get not just incredible performances out of horror, but that their whole foundations are based on, whether they work or not, are based on the incredible performances from their actors. And this is like one of the most massive exercises in that we've seen with that so far. So, and it's also in regards to the horror of it. I do like that they don't really go for the jump scare factor really much at all, because I mean they're in there, but this movie doesn't like have the jump scare noise. Sort of like at one point when we see the evil version of the sun climb up the window when they first invade, and it's like in any other, like I was kind of shocked, and it's like it was less that I was shocked by the fact that he appeared, and more like, holy shit, they actually didn't use the jump scare sound there. That's incredible. So I mean, don't get the wrong idea. It is like really, really well done in its own right. Not just when you compare it to how shitty it could have been in a director's hands that isn't trying near as much. And just making some generic horror movie or whatever. It really does stand on its own merits without any sort of comparison to lesser movies. So there's that. There is something that could potentially be jarring in the not so good sense. Which is, well, there's a couple of things. The use of flashbacks happens quite a bit, because obviously Lupita had this traumatizing experience as a child in the opening scene, and now she's kind of living with that, but as these coincidences start to happen to her, and she kind of, it makes her remember things from her past. So there's the thing, like, sometimes they're like really meticulously timed flashbacks, but other times they can feel like kind of sudden in the moment. But it is one of those things where I feel like once I see it again, it'll be like, I feel like that is better put together than it seems on the surface. So I'm interested to see if that kind of falls into place for me more after I've seen it again some more. But there's also a lot of things that there's a lot of there's tension breaking, and I think sometimes it's intentional, but sometimes it isn't. Obviously, you can tell when it's intentional because there'll be like a comedic line. There's one particular moment that I like when it's really sort of downplayed but still there. It's fine. Like when Winston Duke is first confronting the family when they're at the end of the driveway, and he's saying he's trying to threaten them to get them away, and he says like the police are on their way. But when he says on their way, he like deepens his voice, like he's trying to be more threatening and failing. Little things like that work, but sometimes there are sort of comedic punctuations that are maybe a little too big, one of which I'll mention in a second. But the other thing is, in the maybe not so intentional ways of breaking tension, there's a lot of cutting back and forth between certain scenes. Like Lupita will be doing something or dealing with something in one area while Winston Duke is dealing with something in another area. And like just as the scene is like building, you kind of wish these scenes were sort of individual instead of cutting back and forth. This happens once at the end too, pretty blatantly, but where it just feels like a scene is going and going, and then just when the tension is like really at a peak, it'll cut to what the other character's doing and then go back and forth. I don't know how well that works tension-wise. I think it kind of suffers a little bit. Like I said, they could have just maybe been entire scenes one after the other instead of cutting back, but once again, maybe that's something that'll gel with me more the second time around. But what we were talking about in regards to how the darkness is handled, but with some of the comedy in there also, the kill scenes themselves, are interesting in the sense because there is one incredible kill scene where we basically see the whole thing outside of a house, and it's fantastic. And the start of this scene too is like so. To me, it's the moment that kind of got under my skin the most. Like when I try to sleep tonight, I'm going to be seeing that image and I won't be able to. Uh, but the thing here is that this scene that is so incredible and so scary and jarring and sudden, like it just comes out of the screen and like just shakes you in your seat, um, is punctuated with like a big joke. Like there's a huge punchline to this scene, for comedic effect, and I don't know. I don't, I don't know if that totally works, but I do love the scene itself anyway. And it is a funny joke. It is. Just after the scene that it is after, I don't know. So it's a maybe a little bit one thing then the other suddenly, but the direction that scene does go eventually, though, it manages to find its way to balance out, so I won't hold it too much against it. Um, and then every now and then, just in the apparently true Peele fashion, it's kind of hard to say after only two movies, but it's like he does seem to have. We've also got his whole comedy career. Also, I guess we can go on in regards to just those little touches. One that kind of stood out to me was the realism of when we see some particular carnage on like the news, and the video they show is a vertical video, like you would see. Like for some reason, all those videos that feel like such real raw footage for some reason are always in the vertical, even today, no matter where technology has gotten, where like you're watching just like the scariest shit on YouTube or something, it's always in the fucking vertical video. So I thought that was kind of a nice touch, and kind of added to a certain realism in regards to the world and this violence that it's set up. So yeah, and I can see where he really definitely went out of his way, because I remember hearing a while back that he like worked really he like worked really extensively and researched really extensively to make sure that he didn't get into the whole sophomore slump thing, which is the whole thing where you make your first movie, which is like this huge thing and everybody loves it and all that, and then there's the pressure of your second movie, and more often than not, the second movie does not recapture that, and typically it's this whole thing of maybe they put all of their ideas and creativity and talent into the one thing, and then there was nothing left. But to the point that he like studied a lot of big directors' second movies, or the really successful ones anyway. And I would say overall that paid off. Like I don't know, well I don't know, because I like this a lot. Because I was going to say I don't know if I'm going to love it as much as I love to Get Out after seeing it as many times, but we'll see. Because I do really like this a lot. I do think that once we get to a certain point, I think the climax is probably going to be underwhelming for a lot of people, and there is... This is definitely something I want to talk about, but there's a certain turn also where it's like it leaves you with a lot of questions. Like like it's one of those cases where I feel like with just how meticulous of a movie maker that he is, that there are certain explanations, but it's hard to say. But like I feel like it's not as like doesn't add up as much as it seems right now. But once again, a second viewing will surely go into this also, but and obviously also there's going to be a whole lot of layers and themes and all that, but that on top of all the spoilers and stuff like that and going into all that stuff, we'll go into with the next one, but that's pretty much what I wanted to get out here, so sorry, I didn't mean to say that. So yeah, after the first time, I do really like it, so I'm actually pretty excited to see what a second time does. So we'll see what happens, and until then, that's it.